The sky disappeared first, then sound itself failed. 1,000 metal birds devoured the blue, their shadows merging into artificial night. Some called it strategic bombing, others the day America blocked out the sun over Germany. Below, faces turned upward, mothers, soldiers, children, all witnessing the same impossible darkness, their world reduced to a simple truth. Nothing would ever be the same. The metal rain was coming. The morning broke with unusual clarity over Dresden, a crisp autumn day, with the kind of blue sky that seemed to promise peace, despite 3 years of war. Margarete Schultz hung laundry in her small courtyard, sheets billowing like surrendering flags in the gentle breeze, while her son Karl played with wooden blocks nearby, constructing towers only to knock them down with childish glee. The radio inside their apartment had been silent all morning, a small mercy she had grown to appreciate after years of propaganda and increasingly desperate announcements about the glorious Reich's inevitable victory. In the distance, church bells tolled 9 times, their resonance carrying across the ancient city with the same certainty they had for centuries, marking time in a world where time itself seemed increasingly fragile and precious. Margarete paused, clothespin in hand, to feel the warmth of sunlight on her face, closing her eyes momentarily to imagine a world without air raid sirens, without ration cards, without the constant gnawing fear that had become as much a part of daily life as breathing. The smell of neighbor Frau Weber's bread, made with secretly hoarded real flour rather than the sawdust-supplemented government issue, wafted through the courtyard, an aroma from before the war. At the Luftwaffe Command Center 20 kilometers outside the city, Major Werner Hoffmann studied the radar screens with the concentrated intensity of a man who knew exactly what the empty, sweeping lines meant. Safety, if only temporary. The morning report showed clear conditions all across the Reich's eastern territories, no Allied bombing formations detected approaching from England, no Soviet air activity on the Eastern Front. Perhaps today would be one of the increasingly rare days when no German cities would burn, when no factories would be reduced to twisted metal graves, when the fire brigades could rest. Karl's blocks clattered to the ground as he abandoned his play, pointing skyward with the instinctive curiosity of childhood. Mutti, birds, so many birds. Margaret followed his small, outstretched finger toward the western horizon, where indeed something was gathering, not birds, but tiny specks that glinted silver in the morning light. At first just a few, then dozens, then hundreds, filling the western approach in a formation that stretched across the entire visible sky, their distant engine drone building slowly like an approaching thunderstorm. The radar operator's voice cracked with strain as he called out to Major Hoffmann, "Sir, massive formation detected, western approach, altitude 8,000 meters, count exceeding 300 aircraft and still registering." Hoffmann's coffee cup slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the concrete floor as he stared at the screen in disbelief, watching as the radar signature grew not just larger, but seemed to consume the entire display, like nothing he had ever seen in 4 years of war. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "They're sending everything." The church bells stopped mid-toll as the air raid sirens began their mournful wail across Dresden, but Margarete barely heard them as she stared upward, watching the blue sky disappear piece by piece, aircraft after aircraft, hundreds, more than hundreds, filling every visible patch of heaven with aluminum and steel. Their contrails connecting like an enormous web, being woven across what had been, just moments before, the last blue sky she would see for a very long time. The sun dimmed, then disappeared entirely, as if some vengeful god had decided that Germany had seen enough daylight. Colonel James Doolittle stood in the briefing room at RAF Bassingbourn, surrounded by hundreds of pilots and navigators whose faces reflected a mixture of determination and barely concealed apprehension. The mission map behind him showed the target, Dresden, marked with a large red circle, the flight paths of 1,000 bombers traced in chalk like the veins of some great beast stretching across the English Channel and into the heart of Nazi Germany. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the unprecedented scale of what they were about to attempt, "today we show the German war machine what American industry is truly capable of." The pre-dawn darkness outside the windows held the silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, their massive forms stretching across the airfield in rows that seemed to extend to the horizon, ground crews swarming around them like ants attending to giants. Each aircraft was being loaded with bombs, high explosives, incendiaries, each flying fortress carrying a payload that could flatten a city block, multiplied now by hundreds. The smell of aviation fuel hung heavy in the air, mixing with cigarette smoke and the acrid scent of nervous sweat as men contemplated the statistical improbability of returning from such a massive operation. Lieutenant Michael Sullivan studied the target photographs spread before him, memorizing landmarks, railroad junctions, factory outlines, the infrastructure of war that they would soon reduce to rubble. At 22, he had already flown 17 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, watching friends disappear in blooms of black flak or spiraling down trailing smoke and fire. His hands no longer shook when he reviewed intelligence reports, but something about today's mission felt different. The scale, the commitment of resources, the hushed tone in the voices of commanding officers who usually bellowed with confidence. "Our intelligence indicates minimal cloud cover over the target area," the meteorological officer announced, pointing to weather charts with the authority of a man whose predictions would determine the fate of thousands, both in the air and on the ground. "Visibility should be excellent for the bombing runs, which means visibility will also be excellent for German anti-aircraft batteries and fighter squadrons." A murmur ran through the assembled airmen, not quite fear, but the recognition of what they were facing. The most heavily defended airspace in history, now to be challenged by the largest bombing formation ever assembled. In the ready room, radio operator Sergeant David Cohen wrote what might be his final letter home, fountain pen scratching against V-mail paper with deliberate care. "Dear Mom," he wrote, "by the time you read this, we'll have made history, though I can't tell you how just yet." He paused, considering what else he could say without triggering the sensors, then continued, "Just know that when you look up at the sky tonight, somewhere I'm looking at the same stars, though from a different angle." Around him, hundreds of men engaged in similar rituals, writing letters, checking photographs of sweethearts and children, some praying quietly, others engaging in forced bravado to mask the understanding that statistically many of them would not return. The first engines coughed to life at 0400 hours, then dozens more, then hundreds, until the entire airfield vibrated with the thunder of 4,000 Pratt & Whitney and Wright Cyclone engines at full power, a symphony of American industrial might preparing to take flight. The sound was physical, a pressure wave that rattled windows and bones alike, drowning out thought itself as the first aircraft began to roll down the runway, heavily laden with fuel and bombs, straining against gravity, until reluctantly, one by one, they lifted into the pre-dawn darkness, their navigation lights tracing paths like earthbound stars, ascending to form new, man-made constellations in the night sky over England. No man who witnessed it would ever forget the sound, like the world itself was tearing apart at the seams. The formation assembled over the English Channel, aircraft rising from a dozen different airfields to join the great aerial armada, finding their assigned positions with practiced precision despite the darkness. Dawn broke as they crossed the Dutch coast, the first rays of sunlight illuminating a sky filled with aircraft, to a degree never before witnessed in the history of warfare. B-17s and B-24s in tight combat boxes, stretching from horizon to horizon, their gun turrets tracking constantly for the Luftwaffe interceptors that would surely come. From below, Dutch civilians emerged from their homes despite the early hour, standing in streets and fields to witness the impossible spectacle of 1,000 bombers passing overhead, the individual drone of engines merging into a continuous, thunderous roar that seemed to emanate from the sky itself rather than from any collection of machines. Navigator Lieutenant William Harrison checked his charts against the landmarks passing below, making minute corrections to keep their B-17, Lady Luck, in perfect formation with the hundreds of other aircraft surrounding them. The cockpit was cold, despite the late autumn sun now streaming through the plexiglass, the temperature at 25,000 feet well below freezing, causing ice crystals to form on the inside of the aircraft, and the oxygen masks that kept the crew alive in the thin, high-altitude air. Harrison could see his breath fogging with each exhalation, the moisture immediately crystallizing on his fleece-lined leather flying jacket as he made calculations with fingers stiff from cold despite his gloves. Top turret gunner Sergeant Frank Martinez rotated his twin 50 caliber machine guns in a constant scanning pattern, searching the sky for the German fighters that had thus far failed to materialize in the numbers they had all feared. "Where are they?" he muttered into his oxygen mask, the intercom carrying his voice to the rest of the crew. "Too many of us," replied tail gunner Corporal James Wilson from his isolated position at the rear of the aircraft, his voice tinged with the gallows humor that sustained bomber crews. "Jerry's still trying to count how many we sent, probably thinks his radar's broken." Nervous laughter crackled through the intercom, quickly fading to tense silence as they approached the German border, where the true test of their mission would begin. The first flak bursts appeared in the sky ahead, black puffs of smoke erupting seemingly at random at first, then with increasing density and accuracy as German anti-aircraft batteries found their range. The Lady Luck shuddered as nearby explosions buffeted her with concussive force, fragments of hot metal occasionally pinging against her aluminum skin like deadly hail. Pilot Captain Robert Anderson held the controls with white-knuckled determination, maintaining their position in the formation despite the instinctive urge to take evasive action. Breaking formation meant becoming an isolated target, a death sentence over German territory where Luftwaffe fighters preyed on stragglers with merciless efficiency. From his position in the nose, Bombardier Lieutenant Thomas Wright could see the target city appearing on the horizon, still beautiful and largely intact despite 3 years of war, its Baroque architecture gleaming in the midday sun. Through his bomb sight, he began the calculations that would determine exactly when to release their payload, factoring in airspeed, altitude, and wind conditions with mechanical precision, his mind deliberately not engaging with the human consequences that would follow his mathematics. Behind him in the radio compartment, Sergeant Cohen monitored the command frequency, hearing the voice of the lead bombardier announcing, "Approaching initial point, bomb bay doors opening, all aircraft prepare to release on my mark." The bomb bay doors of 1,000 aircraft opened nearly simultaneously, a mechanical gesture multiplied across the sky like a collective inhalation before the scream. In that moment, as the sun reflected off polished aluminum and the drone of engines filled the world from horizon to horizon, the citizens of Dresden experienced something unprecedented in human history, a man-made solar eclipse. As the sky turned from blue to silver to darkness, the sun itself obscured by the most formidable expression of industrial warfare ever assembled. In air raid shelters and cellars throughout the city, people huddled together in darkness, listening to the overwhelming sound above, feeling the earth itself seem to tremble not from explosions, not yet, but simply from the combined vibration of 4,000 engines passing overhead. The weight of man's ingenuity turned toward destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. The first bombs fell at precisely 12:07, released from the lead aircraft, and followed in rapid succession by hundreds, then thousands more, their whistling descent creating a terrifying chorus that penetrated even the deepest shelters. Margaret clutched Carl to her chest in the basement of their apartment building, surrounded by neighbors who had become a kind of family through shared hardship. Frau Weber with her arthritic hands clutching a small Bible. The Hoffmann twins, who had lost their father at Stalingrad. Old Herr Schmidt, who had survived the previous war only to find himself in another. The concrete around them shuddered with impacts that seemed impossibly close, dust raining from the ceiling with each concussion, the electric lights flickering once, twice, then failing completely, leaving them in darkness broken only by a few hastily lit candles. Above, the city was transforming under the mathematical precision of Allied bombing doctrine. Primary target areas marked on maps in London and Washington were becoming concentric circles of destruction on the ground. Industrial sectors first, then transportation hubs, then the inevitable collateral damage as some aircraft, damaged by flak or fighters, released their payloads early or off target. The ancient Frauenkirche, which had stood since the 18th century, took a direct hit that shattered its iconic stone dome, centuries of architectural achievement reduced to rubble in seconds. Nearby, the Zwinger Palace's Baroque facades crumbled under repeated concussions, priceless artwork and cultural treasures either destroyed outright or exposed to the elements through newly created gaping wounds in walls and ceilings. In the cockpit of Lady Luck, Captain Anderson fought to maintain level flight through increasingly dense flak, and the turbulence created by hundreds of explosions below. "Bombs away!" announced Lieutenant Wright from the nose, his voice professionally detached as their payload of high explosives and incendiaries fell toward the increasingly obscured target below. The aircraft, suddenly 7,000 pounds lighter, lurched upward, requiring immediate compensation on the controls. "Turn to heading 270, Navigator Harrison instructed, plotting their course away from the target and back toward the relative safety of Allied airspace, a journey of 4 hours during which they would remain under constant threat from German defenses. Major Hoffmann stood outside the Luftwaffe command bunker, which had taken a direct hit during the first wave, staring upward with a mixture of professional assessment and personal horror at the continuing procession of bombers still arriving, still dropping their payloads on a city already transformed by fire and explosions. The radar station was destroyed, communications severed, any coordinated defense now impossible. A young lieutenant approached, his uniform covered in concrete dust, a bleeding cut across his forehead. "Sir, we've managed to scramble 60 fighters from southern bases, but they report the American formation extends beyond visual range in all directions. They're attacking where possible," but he hesitated, then finished with military bluntness. "It's like trying to stop the ocean with a broom." In the shelter, 5-year-old Carl had stopped crying, moving into the eerie calm that sometimes affects children in moments of extremis, his small face illuminated by candlelight as he asked questions that Margaret couldn't answer. "Why are they dropping so many bombs? When will it stop? Are they trying to kill everyone?" Around them, the adults maintained a strained silence punctuated by prayers, the sharing of water from carefully hoarded bottles, and the occasional outburst of emotion quickly suppressed. Frau Weber, who had lost her husband in the previous war, suddenly laughed, a sound so incongruous that everyone turned to stare. "The Americans," she said, her voice carrying a strange wonder. "They must have so many factories, so much metal, to build so many planes. How could we ever think to beat such a country?" By mid-afternoon, the final waves of bombers were departing, leaving behind a city fundamentally altered, not just in its physical form, where once grand boulevards had become cratered moonscapes and entire districts burned with unchecked fires, but in its comprehension of warfare itself. The people of Dresden had experienced something qualitatively different from previous air raids, not just destruction, but obliteration, not just an attack, but an expression of industrial disparity so profound that it rendered conventional notions of military resistance almost meaningless. As smoke blotted out the sun that the bombers had earlier obscured, those emerging from shelters looked upward not in fear of further attack, but in a kind of dazed incomprehension at the empty sky, now seeming somehow vaster and more threatening in its sudden emptiness than it had been when filled with the machines of war. Lady Luck limped across the English Channel as darkness fell. One engine dead, another sputtering, her fuselage pierced in 17 places by flak and the cannon fire of a Focke-Wulf 190 that had made a single passing attack before being driven off by the combined firepower of their formation. In the waist gun position, Sergeant Paul Mitchell pressed a blood-soaked bandage against the thigh of Corporal Wilson, who had taken a fragment of German flak through his position in the tail. "Almost home, Jimmy," Mitchell repeated like a mantra, though home was still 50 miles distant, and Wilson's face had taken on the grey pallor that experienced crewmen recognized all too well. The radio crackled with continuous traffic, aircraft declaring emergencies, requesting priority landing, reporting casualties and damage in voices made flat by exhaustion and the particular numbness that follows intense combat. At Gare F. Basingbourn, ambulances and fire trucks lined the runway, their lights creating pools of harsh illumination in the gathering darkness as the armada returned, not as the orderly formation that had departed that morning, but as a stream of damaged aircraft, some trailing smoke, others flying on fewer engines than they were designed to require, a few making emergency landings in fields when they couldn't quite reach their designated airfields. Intelligence officers waited in debriefing rooms with cups of coffee laced with medicinal brandy, prepared to record the details of the mission while medical staff stood ready to treat the wounded and count the dead. The dual bookkeeping of strategic bombing. Results achieved measured against losses sustained. Colonel Doolittle studied the preliminary reports with the detached analysis of a man responsible for balancing mission objectives against human lives. 873 aircraft had returned thus far, with another 42 reported as making emergency landings at secondary fields or in Allied-controlled territories on the continent. 85 were confirmed lost, with their status unknown, downed over enemy territory, crews either killed, captured, or, for a fortunate few, evading capture with the help of resistance networks. The target had been successfully struck, with reconnaissance aircraft already processing photographs showing extensive damage to industrial, transportation, and urban sectors. A secretary placed a cup of coffee at his elbow. He didn't touch it, continuing to read reports with eyes that had been awake for nearly 40 hours. In Dresden, Margaret and Karl emerged from their shelter to find a world transformed beyond recognition. Their apartment building still stood, though all its windows had been blown out and part of the roof had collapsed. The familiar streets around it had become a labyrinth of debris, unexploded ordnance, and fires that continued to burn despite the efforts of overwhelmed emergency services. The air smelled of burning wood, melted metal, ruptured gas lines, and the unmistakable sweet, sour odor of death. Karl clutched his mother's hand with unusual strength, his 5-year-old mind struggling to reconcile the world he had known yesterday with the apocalyptic landscape before him now. "Where did our city go?" he asked, his voice small but steady, a child's directness cutting through adult prevarications. Captain Anderson brought Lady Luck in on a wing and a prayer, the damaged bomber touching down hard but remaining intact as it rolled to a stop at the end of the runway, immediately surrounded by emergency vehicles responding to their declared emergency status. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, helping the exhausted airmen descend on wobbly legs after 12 hours in combat conditions. Corporal Wilson was removed on a stretcher, his fate uncertain. The rest gathered in a somber knot on the tarmac, lighting cigarettes with hands that still trembled slightly from adrenaline and fatigue, looking up occasionally at the continued stream of aircraft still landing, counting the survivors with the superstitious vigilance of men, who knew that next time the empty spaces in formation might be where they had flown. As night settled fully over both England and Germany, two worlds, connected by violence, contemplated what had transpired. The boundaries of aerial warfare pushed to new extremes, the calculus of industrial might translated directly into destructive capability. In a farmhouse near Dresden, Margarete sat with Karl by candlelight, having fled the dangerous ruins of the city for the relative safety of her cousin's rural home. The boy had finally fallen asleep, his face in repose, showing none of the shock it had held earlier in the day. She stroked his hair gently, thinking not of politics or strategic bombing or the justice or injustice of what had happened, but of simpler things. How quickly the world could change, how sunshine one moment could become darkness the next, how the sky itself had been transformed from a realm of birds and clouds and weather into something else entirely. A domain now dominated by machines of such power that they could blot out the sun. Above the farmhouse, stars emerged in the night sky, the same stars visible over England where exhausted air crews slept or drank or stared silently into darkness. All of them, German and American, civilian and military, united, if only in their shared witness, to a day when mankind had demonstrated both the pinnacle of its technological achievement and the depths of its capacity for destruction. A day when 1,000 American bombers had blocked out the sun over Germany. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.